Lots to get through today. Joining me now, the Australian's national editor, as he does on a Monday, Ms Shanahan. Well, thank you for your time. I'll get stuck into Newspoll in a moment, but I have to go to that issue today with Home Affairs Minister Clare O'Neil, trying to explain away why they were asleep at the wheel, because she said she was advised by her department that they would likely win the High Court case. So no need, Dennis, for a plan B. That's at odds with those secret emails released by Andrew Clennell late this afternoon that show her department back in September, so well and truly before she made those comments, talking to the US government about how they could resettle the bloke that instigated that High Court challenge, the child sex abuser. This issue isn't going away, and I think it's one of those things, Dennis, and you know, particular things cut through like nothing else. This is one of those things that voters have picked up on, and they're pretty angry about it.
There's no doubt about that. It has cut right through. It's the number of criminals who've been released. But more than that, it's the lack of competence shown by the government, the lack of anticipation. Even if a department had given them advice that they were going to win the High Court, a prudent minister will say, well, let's just have a look here and see what we can do if we do lose. I remember Malcolm Turnbull telling the Parliament how the High Court would find. He said, they will find. No, they didn't. And he was completely caught short. This has happened to Julia Gillard, I've mentioned before. The Malaysian people swap failed. So what we actually have is a normal ministerial duty to prepare for the likelihood of a High Court decision going against, as Clare O'Neil says, the most litigated department in the entire government. And yet they didn't. But worse than that, what they were doing was also trying to head off the High Court decision. And why would you be doing that if you didn't think you might lose? And that heading it off was to expel the person who was the sex offender, get him sent off to Bangladesh or Saudi Arabia, get the US to take him, New Zealand, wherever they could get rid of him, they wanted to, because they knew that this could open up literally Pandora's box on all of these detention, people in detention. And tomorrow we may see with the reasons the rest of the 340 also being released, all because of a lack of anticipation. Yes, you needed the full reasons, and I think the High Court was very slack in not providing its reasons immediately on such a serious issue. But you still need the reasons to make final legislation. You don't need it to make some sort of precautionary legislation, as we saw 10 days ago when within 12 hours the government passed the legislation because the coalition supported it. This has been a failure of government, a failure of governance and a failure of ministerial responsibility.
I was one of the first to say a big problem for the Voice campaign on the yes side was Linda Burney. I said Linda Burney is like an albatross. She's not an advocate on this issue. She's a real problem. Of course, they couldn't do anything about her. I suspect they will when a reshuffle comes at Christmas time. I think if Clare O'Neil stays in this job, they will never recover on this issue of broader protection. So we'll see what happens over Christmas. Let's go to that Newspoll. 31% primary vote. It's a shocker. Worst for Labor in a decade. For the coalition, they've had a 4-point gain. Their primary's now at 38. You like it to have a 4 in front if you're the coalition, because Labor can combine their primary vote, of course, with the Greens. In 2PP terms, they're 50-50, neck and neck. What does this tell you, Dennis Shanahan?
Well, it tells me that Labor's in a great deal of trouble and that the public have woken up to it. There's a question of competence. There is obviously a failure as far as the appeal for Anthony Albanese is concerned. I think the failure of the Indigenous referendum was clearly the beginning of this, but we've seen since then crisis after crisis, event after event mishandled by the government. And now what we are seeing is that disapproval rating with Anthony Albanese, which has been there for a while, now bleeding into the government big time. This is a terrible time for the government to go into the summer break on its lowest primary vote in a decade. And I simply, 50-50 on two-party preferred, well, that's a calculation. It's based on all sorts of things. And we know that Anthony Albanese just scraped in at the last election with a one-seat majority on a primary vote bigger than this. So it really has shaken the Labor Party, because people for some time have been saying there is a real prospect of a minority government. There is still time, there's plenty of time, but so far, no sign the government has woken up to the fact it needs to do something, it needs to perform better, and leaves open the prospect of a one-term government, a minority government at best.
Let's go to something else I picked up this afternoon, and it's a real worry. A Labor-controlled parliamentary committee has recommended that the ACT and the Northern Territory get 2 extra senators. So currently they've got 2, they'd go to 4 each, which would in effect, as I read it, give Labor considerable upper house power. Power, of course, in government, yes, you'd assume the swing's on, they get the numbers in the upper house, but given the way the ACT and the NT tend to fall out, I think it would give them huge power in opposition as well, effectively giving them some sort of workable majority, whether they're in power or not. What's your take here? And the other point is, I think the government will move on this, Dennis. What do you think?
Yes, well, I think the committee also suggests that they look at a proposal to expand the House of Representatives to 175 or 200 MPs to ensure that we're on level with pegging with the UK as far as proportional representation is concerned. That's not going to happen. I think the government will be very keen to increase the number of senators in the ACT and the Northern Territory, double it from 2 to 4 in each, because what that will necessarily do in the ACT is, over the years, ensure a progressive count in the ACT of 3 to 1. It may even be 4 if you have a Green or 2 independents and 2 Labor. This is a foundation stone for a long-term, never-ending, progressive stranglehold on the Senate. If you can count on 3 votes, 3 solid votes out of the ACT and 2 out of the Northern Territory, you have a 5-member Senate base that you can then come down to when it comes to balance of power in the Senate. It basically means the Conservative side of politics could be frozen out of the Senate forever. I think the government will be keen to do this. I don't think they'll worry about expanding the number of MPs to 200. They'll just say, oh, no, we don't need that, and increase the number of senators in the Senate. It is too tempting for Labor not to do it. Mind you, they don't have a mandate. They didn't do any of this before the last election, and putting in more politicians is never a popular idea.